And this is our next set of examples, and this is a little bit complicated example. We are talking about 4 genes. So in the previous examples we were talking about only one gene, and that gene was causing a disease. Mutation in that gene was causing a disease which was transmitted in autosomal recessive pattern. But here we are not talking about any disease. We are just talking about 4 genes, and these 4 genes, they are not linked to each other, rather they are independently assorting in meiosis, and these genes are labeled as A, B, D, and E. So consider a cross of the individual who is homozygous dominant for the A gene, heterozygous for B and D genes, and homozygous dominant for the E gene, with an individual who is homozygous recessive for the A allele, heterozygous for B and D alleles, and heterozygous for the E allele as well. So this is the cross. So first thing that we have to do is we have to find out the gametes. So I'm leaving it on to you that you have to find out that what are the gametes, although the gametes are mentioned here in the table as well. So there are 32 outcomes, and we have the 4 gametes from first individual, which are presented in columns, and we have how many gametes from the other individual. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we have 8 type of gametes from the second parent, from the second individual. So that is why we have 32 outcomes. So 8 by 4 is 32. So we have these 32 outcomes, right? So now we have questions. Question is, what is the probability that a child is homozygous for all the dominant alleles? The second question is, what is the probability that a child is homozygous for all the recessive alleles? The third question is, what is the probability that a child is homozygous dominant for one gene and heterozygous for the other genes? The fourth question is, what is the probability that a child is homozygous recessive for one gene and heterozygous for the other genes? The fifth question is, what is the probability that a child is heterozygous for all genes? And the last question is, what is the probability that first 2 children are heterozygous for all genes? So these are the questions that we have, and now we are going to get the answers for these questions. So starting from the question number 1, which is, what is the probability that a child is homozygous for all the dominant alleles? So the possible genotype for this type of child is 1, only 1. Why? Because all of the genes, they are supposed to be homozygous for the dominant alleles. So this is a possible genotype. Probability is 0 by 32. Why probability is 0 by 32? Because when we looked into all these 32 outcomes, none of the genotypes was this one, right? None of the genotypes was homozygous dominant for all of the 4 genes. So probability is 0.0. Probability for a child to be homozygous for all the dominant alleles is 0. So this is our answer. Next question is, what is the probability that a child is homozygous for all the recessive alleles? So what is going to be our possible genotype in this case? So this is going to be represented by the homozygous recessive alleles of all of the 4 genes. And we need to find out this genotype in this cross, and we can see that there is no such genotype. So probability is 0 out of 32. So probability for a child to be homozygous for all the recessive alleles is 0 in this specific cross, right? Now the third question is, what is the probability that a child is homozygous dominant for one gene and heterozygous for the other genes? So possible genotypes are many, right? So how many possible genotypes are there? There are 4 possible genotypes. The first genotype is in which the A allele is homozygous dominant and the B, D, and E alleles are heterozygous. The second possibility is in which the B allele is homozygous for the dominant, B gene is homozygous dominant for the homozygous for the dominant allele, and A, D, and E are heterozygous. So the third possible genotype is that in which the D gene is homozygous dominant allele, and the rest of the three, A, B, and E, they are heterozygous. And the fourth one is in which the E genotype is homozygous dominant and the A, B, and D are heterozygous. So these are the possible genotypes. Now, is this a compound probability or is this a simple probability? So this is a compound probability. As you can see, why this is a compound probability, because we are talking about different outcomes. The outcomes are 4 types of genotypes. And why we are taking the sum of these? Because the nature of the outcome is 1, right? The nature of all of these outcomes is the genotype. So that is why we are going to take the sum of all these 4 genotypes. So when we look into the table, we can see that there is no individual who is homozygous dominant for the A gene and heterozygous for the others, right? And then for the next genotype, we see that 2 individuals belong to that genotype, which is homozygous dominant for the B gene and heterozygous for the others. And then there are 2 individuals who are homozygous dominant for the D gene and who are heterozygous for A, B, and E. And for the fourth one, we have 4 individuals who are homozygous dominant for the E gene and who are heterozygous for A, B, and D. And these are their respective individual probabilities: 0 plus 0.0625 plus 0.0625 plus 0.125, and their sum is 0.25. So the answer to this question is probability that a child is homozygous dominant for one gene and heterozygous for the other genes is 0.25. So this is our answer. So this is our second question, next question, which is, I think, the fourth question, right? So what is the probability that a child is homozygous recessive for one gene and heterozygous for the other genes? So again, we are talking about more than one genotype. So the first possible genotype is that in which the person is homozygous recessive for the A gene and heterozygous for the other 3. And the second possible genotype is in which the person is homozygous recessive for the B allele and heterozygous for the others. And the third possible genotype is that in which the individual is homozygous recessive for the D gene and heterozygous for the others. And the fourth possible genotype is that in which the individual is homozygous recessive for EE genotype and heterozygous for the other 3 genes. So now we take the individual probabilities of these genotypes and we take the sum of these individual probabilities, because again we are talking about more than one outcome, but the type of the outcome is same. So therefore this is a compound probability in which we are taking the sum of individual probabilities. So when we look into the outcome table, then what do we have? We have 0 individual who is homozygous recessive for the A allele and heterozygous for the others. Then we have 2 individuals who are homozygous recessive for the B allele and heterozygous for the others. And then we have 2 individuals who are homozygous for the D gene and heterozygous for the others. And then we have no individual who is homozygous recessive for the E and heterozygous for the others. So their respective probabilities are 0 plus 0.0625 plus 0.0625 plus 0, and their combined probability is 0.125. So the answer is probability that a child is homozygous recessive for one gene and heterozygous for the other genes is 0.125. So this is the answer to the question. The next question is, what is the probability that a child is heterozygous for all genes, right? So what is the possible genotype? It is only one. So a person who is homozygous for A, B, D, and E genes. And when we look into the table, we find 4 individuals out of 32 who have this genotype. So their probability is 0.125. So probability that a child is heterozygous for all genes is 0.125. So this is the simple probability. This is not the compound probability, right? Now our last question is, what is the probability that first 2 children are heterozygous for all genes? The possible genotype is heterozygous for all genes, but is this probability a simple probability or it is a compound probability? Okay, so this is a compound probability. Why? Because although the type of outcome is only one, but the events are 2. So we are talking about the combined probability of 2 consecutive events, the first 2 children to be heterozygous for all genes. So the possible genotype, possible outcome is 1, but the events are 2 consecutive events. So what we are going to do with the individual probabilities, we are going to multiply these individual probabilities. So probability of first child to be heterozygous for all 4 genes multiplied by probability of second child to be heterozygous for all 4 genes. So when we look into the table, we have 4 individuals who are heterozygous for all the 4 genes. So this is 4 by 32 multiplied by 4 by 32. This is 0.125 multiplied by 0.125, and the answer is 0.0156. So we can state our answer as probability that first 2 children are heterozygous for all genes is 0.0156. So this is the answer to our question. Now we take another example, and this is the same example. We are talking about 4 genes that are assorting independently in meiosis, and this time we are considering a cross of individuals. One of these individuals is homozygous dominant for A and B genes and heterozygous for D and E genes. And then the second person is homozygous recessive for A and B genes and heterozygous for D and E genes. So this is the cross that we are considering. So we are talking about 16 outcomes. So what are the outcomes? We have 16 outcomes here because there are 4 types of gametes that are produced by each individual. Now the questions are, what is the probability that a child is homozygous for all the dominant alleles? What is the probability that a child is homozygous for all the recessive alleles? What is the probability that a child is homozygous dominant for one gene and heterozygous for the other genes? The fourth question is, what is the probability that a child is homozygous recessive for one gene and heterozygous for the other genes? The fifth question is, what is the probability that a child is heterozygous for all genes? And the last question is, what is the probability that first 2 children are heterozygous for all genes? So these are the questions that you have, and you have the outcomes of that cross as well. So these are the questions that you have to answer yourself. So this is the exercise that you have to completely do on your own, right? So this is it for today's lecture. So I think these exercises are sufficient enough, and still if you have any questions, you can list those questions for the question answer session. And also in the question answer session, remember we have to, what we have to do is we have to discuss the mistakes that have been deliberately introduced into the exercise of chi-square analysis, right? So come prepared.